The sea was calm that morning. In a small village on the coast of Anglo-Saxon England, women were already awake before sunrise. They baked bread. They milked cows. They prepared wool for weaving. Children ran between wooden houses made of timber and straw. The air smelled of smoke and salt. Life was simple, hard, but familiar. Then someone saw something on the horizon, dark. Shapes, long shapes. At first, they looked like birds resting on the water. Then the wind changed, and the shapes became clearer. Ships. Long, narrow ships with carved dragon heads rising from their prows. The Vikings had come. During the late 8th and 9th centuries, Viking raids became a nightmare for England. Norse warriors from Scandinavia, especially from what we now call Norway and Denmark, crossed the North Sea in fast ships. They did not only come for gold, they came for people. The first famous raid recorded in English history happened at the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. Monks were killed, sacred objects were stolen, but something else also happened during many raids. People were captured. Among them were women. In Anglo-Saxon society, women had roles that mattered. They worked farms. They managed households. Some noble women even owned land. They were mothers, daughters, wives, sisters. But during Viking raids, none of that mattered. When the longships reached shore, chaos exploded. Men tried to fight. Some were killed quickly. Others ran. Houses burned. Smoke covered the sky. Children screamed, and women were dragged away. Why women? Because in the Viking world, people could be sold like goods. Slavery was normal in the Viking Age. Enslaved people were called thralls. They worked farms, cleaned homes, and served their masters. Women were especially valuable. They could work. They could bear children. They could be forced into relationships. For Vikings, slaves were wealth. The English coast was easy to reach. Many villages had little protection. There were no strong stone castles yet. No large armies waiting on the beaches. When a raid began, it often ended quickly. Women were tied with ropes. Sometimes their hands were bound. Sometimes they were forced onto ships immediately. Imagine the fear. The smell of burning wood behind you. The sound of waves ahead of you. The knowledge that you may never see your home again. The ships pushed back into the sea. On board, conditions were cruel. There was little space. Captives sat close together. Some cried. Some prayed. Some stared in silence. The journey across the North Sea could take days. Cold winds cut the skin. Salt water soaked clothes. For many women, this was the moment they understood something terrible. They were no longer free. They were property. The Vikings were not always wild monsters as movies show. They were traders as well as warriors. They built towns. They farmed land. They created laws. But their world accepted slavery as normal. In Scandinavian society, thralls had no rights. They could be bought and sold. They could be punished harshly. Their children were usually born into slavery. For English women captured during raids, the future was uncertain. Some were taken directly to Scandinavia. Others were brought to trading centers, like Dublin. Dublin became one of the largest slave markets in the Viking world. Founded by Norse settlers, it became a center of trade, not only for silver and goods, but for human beings. From there, captives could be sold again. Some were sold to Iceland, some to Norway. Some even traveled further into the Islamic world through long trade routes. Yes, Viking trade connected far lands, from England to the Middle East, and English women became part of that trade. Back in England, families searched for missing daughters. Some villages were attacked again and again. Fear became part of daily life. Churches wrote about the terror. Priests described the Vikings as punishment from God. Prayers were written asking for protection from the fury of the Northmen. But prayer could not stop the ships. For women, the fear was deeper than death. Death was final. Captivity was unknown. And the unknown is often worse. Some women resisted capture. There are stories of people fighting desperately, but against trained warriors with weapons, resistance was often short. The Vikings moved fast. They took what they wanted, and they left. As years passed, raids turned into settlements. Vikings began staying in parts of England. They created the Danelaw areas ruled by Norse law. This changed everything. Now, English women did not only fear sudden raids, they lived under new rulers. Some marriages happened between Vikings and local women. Not all were forced. Over time, cultures mixed, but in the early days, many relationships began with violence. Imagine being taken from your home, sold in a foreign land, forced to speak a new language, forced to live under new gods, your old identity slowly fading, your name, perhaps, changed. Your children growing up in a world that does not remember where you came from. That was the horrifying fate many English women faced, and this was only the beginning. Because once they arrived in the slave markets, their value was decided like animals at auction. In part, those we will walk into the slave markets themselves, especially in Dublin, and see how women were displayed, judged, and sold in the Viking world. The sea brought terror, but the markets brought something colder. Calculation, price, ownership. The ships did not always sail directly to Scandinavia. Many turned west. Across rough waters, they reached a growing Viking stronghold that would become one of the most important slave markets in Northern Europe. Dublin. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Dublin was not the quiet city we know today. It was a busy Norse port filled with wooden docks, trading ships, warriors, merchants, and the constant noise of bargaining. Silver changed hands every day. Furs, weapons, amber, silk, livestock, and people. For the captured English women, the arrival in Dublin was another shock. They were pulled from ships. Some were weak from hunger. Some were injured. Some still wore torn pieces of the clothing they had been captured in. They were not treated as guests. They were lined up. In Viking society, slaves were called thralls. Thralls were considered property. They had no legal protection. Their lives depended completely on their owners. The market was simple but brutal. Buyers examined captives closely. Teeth were checked. Hair was pulled back. Skin was inspected. Strong hands meant good labor. Youth meant higher price. Beauty meant even higher value. For young English women, this inspection could be deeply humiliating. They stood in a foreign land where their language was not understood, surrounded by strangers who spoke Old Norse. Their fear meant nothing to the buyers. Only their usefulness mattered. Why were English women especially valuable? First, they were Christians from a farming society. That meant they were familiar with agricultural work, weaving, cooking, and household management. They could contribute immediately to Norse farms and homes. Second, in a world where population growth mattered, women who could bear children were economically valuable. Third, Viking trade routes were large. Slaves were not always kept locally. Some were transported further east into trade networks that reached as far as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. The Vikings were not isolated raiders. They were connected traders. Silver from the Middle East flowed north. Silk from Asia reached Scandinavian lands, and enslaved people were part of this system. Some English women were sold more than once. A woman captured in Northumbria might first be sold in Dublin, then resold to a trader heading to Norway. From there, she might end up in a remote farmstead far from the sea. Others may have traveled east through river routes, controlled by Norse traders. Imagine the confusion. New languages again. New climates. New rules. And always, no control. For many women, the worst moment was not the capture. It was the sale. Because during the raid, there was chaos. But at the market, everything was calm, organized, measured, cold. A price was agreed. Silver coins clinked. And a human life changed owners. Some buyers were wealthy farmers. Some were warriors. Some were merchants. A young, healthy woman might cost more silver than an older captive. Families were often separated permanently. A mother might be sold to one man, her daughter to another. There were no reunions, no letters, no hope of rescue. Christian chroniclers in England wrote about the terror of Viking raids. They described suffering and cruelty, but they often did not describe in detail what happened after captives left England. That silence leaves us to piece together the truth from Norse law codes and archaeology. Norse laws mention thralls clearly. They could be beaten, they could be traded. If a thrall tried to escape, punishment was severe. Freedom was rare, but not impossible. In some cases, a thrall could be freed after many years of loyal service. This was called but even freed thralls rarely reached full equality. For women, life inside Norse households could take different forms. Some were forced into heavy farm labor. They milked animals, they prepared food, they cleaned longhouses. Others became concubines, women kept by powerful men for sexual relationships outside marriage. Concubinage was accepted in Viking society. This meant that some English women were forced into intimate relationships with their owners. Children born from these unions were often considered legitimate if the father accepted them. This created something painful and complex. The blood of England mixed with the blood of Scandinavia. Over generations, these children grew up speaking Norse languages. They followed Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, instead of Christ. The mother's original culture slowly faded. This was not only slavery. It was cultural erasure. A woman who once prayed in an English church might now live in a longhouse, decorated with carved dragon heads. Hearing stories of Valhalla, she might whisper Christian prayers secretly, or she might slowly adapt. Humans adapt to survive. That does not mean the pain disappeared. Some women likely formed bonds with other captives. Shared suffering can create strong friendships. In a foreign land, another English voice might feel like the last connection to home, but even that was uncertain. Because slaves could be sold at any time. Imagine building a small sense of stability, only to be sold again months later. Uncertainty became a constant companion. In Dublin, archaeological discoveries have confirmed the scale of Viking trade. Excavations have revealed slave chains and imported goods from far regions. Written sources from later centuries mention Dublin as a major slave hub. This was not small. It was organized, profitable, and normalized. The Viking Age lasted roughly from the late 8th century to the 11th century. During that time, thousands of people across Britain and Ireland were taken. Women were a significant part of that number. Some historians believe that the high amount of British and Irish DNA found in Iceland today may reflect the presence of enslaved women brought there by Norse settlers. That means their legacy still lives, even if their names do not. Back in England, something changed too. Repeated raids forced kingdoms to adapt. Leaders like Alfred the Great began building fortified towns and stronger defenses. Over time, Viking raids became less easy. But during the early centuries, protection was weak, and so the cycle continued. Raid, capture, sale, transport. For the English women inside the markets of Dublin, they were no longer daughters of England. They were property in a trade system that stretched across seas. But even inside this system, small acts of resistance may have existed. Refusing to forget one's name, teaching a child a Christian prayer, quietly, holding on to a memory of green English fields. Survival itself became resistance. In part 3, we will move beyond the markets and enter the longhouses of Scandinavia to see what daily life truly looked like for these women once they were purchased. Because the horror did not end with the sale. In many ways, it was only beginning. After the market, after the silver-chained hands, after the ropes were untied and tied again, the English women were taken to their new homes. For some, that meant staying in Dublin under Norse control. For others, it meant another journey north, across cold seas to Norway, Denmark, or even Iceland. The longhouse was the center of Viking life. A Viking longhouse was large but dark. The walls were made of wood or turf. A central fire burned in the middle, sending smoke through a hole in the roof. Along the sides were benches where people sat, worked, ate, and slept. Animals were often kept nearby for warmth. Life inside was crowded. For a newly enslaved English woman, everything felt strange. The language was harsh and unfamiliar. The food tasted different. More fish, more preserved meat, fewer soft breads like those she once baked at home. The gods were different too. In Anglo-Saxon England, she may have prayed to Christ. She may have attended church. She may have known Bible stories. In Scandinavia, she heard stories of Odin, the author of Thor and his hammer, of Valhalla, where warriors feasted after death. Her old world did not disappear in one day, but it slowly faded. In Viking society, thralls did the hardest work. They rose before sunrise. They carried water. They cleaned animal stalls. They prepared food. They spun wool and wove cloth. Weaving was important. Cloth was valuable. A woman skilled with a loom could increase a household's wealth. Some English women may have already known weaving. That skill may have made them useful and slightly safer from extreme punishment, but safety was never guaranteed. Thralls had no legal rights. If an owner was cruel, there was little protection. If a thrall tried to escape, the punishment could be severe: beating, branding, or worse. Yet daily life was not always constant violence. That is what makes this history complex. In many Viking households, thralls lived close to the family. They shared the same space. They heard conversations. They watched children grow. Over time, some relationships became less brutal and more controlled routine. That does not erase the fact of slavery. It simply shows how normalized it was. For women forced into concubinage, life became even more complicated. Concubinage was accepted in Norse society. A powerful man could have a wife and also keep other women. An enslaved English woman might be chosen for this role. She had no choice. If she bore children, those children might be recognized by the father. In some cases, children of concubines could rise in status if accepted into the family. This created painful emotions. A mother might love her child deeply, but know that the child would grow up speaking a different language, honoring different gods, and perhaps never knowing her homeland. The mother's English identity could fade within one generation. Some historians believe that a large percentage of the female ancestry in Iceland and parts of Scandinavia comes from the British Isles. That suggests many English and Irish women became part of Norse communities permanently. Their bodies survived. Their names did not. In some longhouses, older thralls supervised younger ones. A hierarchy even existed among the enslaved. A woman who had been captive for many years might know the language well. She might manage other servants. She might have slightly better treatment. But she was still owned. Winter was especially hard. Scandinavian winters were long and dark, snow-covered fields. Days were short. The fire burned constantly. For someone taken from England's milder climate, the cold felt endless. Isolation made everything heavier. There were no letters home. No way to send messages. No ships sailing back for rescue. Even if she somehow escaped, how would she cross the sea alone? Freedom became almost impossible. And yet, humans always search for hope. Some thralls were eventually freed. Norse law allowed masters to free slaves. A freed thrall became a freedman or freedwoman, though still lower in status than freeborn people. Freedom often required loyalty, time, or the birth of important children. But even freedom did not mean return to England. It meant living permanently in Norse lands. Gradually, some women may have adapted. They learned the language. They adopted clothing styles, wool dresses, cloaks, fastened with brooches. They cooked Norse meals. They participated in seasonal festivals. Survival sometimes required blending in, but memory can live quietly inside a person. A whispered prayer, a lullaby sung in Old English, a story told to a child about green hills across the sea. Even if the child did not fully understand, over time, Viking society itself began to change. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Christianity slowly spread into Scandinavia. Norse kings converted. Churches were built. This changed the rules of slavery. Christian teachings discouraged the enslavement of fellow Christians. As more Scandinavians converted, the slave trade slowly decreased. But during the height of the Viking Age, it remained strong. For the English women captured in earlier raids, the damage was already done. Their lives had split into two parts. Before the ships, after the ships. In England, kingdoms were growing stronger. Leaders built fortified towns called burhs. Armies became more organized. The worst years of sudden coastal terror slowly reduced. But in Scandinavian farms and towns, the descendants of those captured women continued living. Blended. Changed. Absorbed. The horrifying fate of English women in Viking slave markets was not always dramatic death. Often, it was something slower. Loss of name. Loss of language. Loss of homeland. A life lived in someone else's world. And yet, through their children and grandchildren, they shaped the very societies that once captured them. Their blood became part of Scandinavian history. Their suffering helped to build farms, towns, and families. History rarely records their voices, but archaeology and DNA whisper their presence. By now, many years may have passed since the day the ships appeared on the English horizon. For the women taken during those raids, life had become something else. Not freedom, not peace, but survival. And survival is powerful. Inside Viking households in Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Norse-controlled Ireland, English women were no longer new captives. Some had learned the language. Some had children. Some had grown older. But even after years, one truth remained. They had not chosen this life. Yet human beings do not only suffer, they adapt. They resist. In quiet ways. Resistance did not always mean open rebellion. Open rebellion would have meant death. Resistance could mean remembering, keeping a birth name alive inside the mind, whispering Christian prayers even after Scandinavia's old gods were praised in the hall, teaching a child a word from Old English before sleep. Small acts, invisible acts, but powerful. In time, something began to change in the Viking world. Trade continued. Raids continued. But Viking leaders began thinking differently about power. They wanted stability. They wanted kingdoms, not hus, lod. And with stability came religion. Christianity slowly entered Scandinavia. Missionaries traveled north. Kings converted to strengthen political alliances with Christian Europe. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Norway and Denmark officially became Christian kingdoms. This shift changed many parts of society. It also affected slavery. Christian law did not immediately end slavery, but it slowly reduced it. Enslaving fellow Christians became harder to justify. Many English captives had always been Christian. Now, as Scandinavia converted, religion created a shared identity. This did not erase suffering from the past, but it changed the future. Some enslaved women may have seen churches built in lands where they once heard only stories of Odin and Thor. That must have been strange, to see the cross raised again, not in England, but in Norway. Did it bring comfort, or did it remind them of everything lost? As Christianity spread, some thralls were freed. Laws evolved. Social structures shifted. But freedom after 20 years is not the same as freedom at the beginning. A woman captured at 16 might be 40 when freed. Her youth gone. Her homeland distant in memory. Her children grown in a culture that was not originally hers. And here we see something important. The story of these English women is not only about suffering, it is also about transformation. Modern genetic studies suggest that many women brought from the British Isles became part of Scandinavian populations. In places like Iceland, a significant portion of early female ancestry appears to come from Britain and Ireland. This means that while their names disappeared, their bloodlines did not. They helped build new societies. They shaped future generations. History often speaks loudly about Viking warriors, but quietly, inside farms and homes, English women were shaping culture too. Food traditions mixed. Language absorbed new words. Stories blended. Even personal names. Cross-cultures. Over generations, what began as forced captivity slowly turned into cultural fusion. But we must not forget how it began. It began with violence, with capture, with markets in places like Dublin, where human lives were priced in silver. The Norse slave trade was not small. It connected northern Europe to wider trade networks. Slaves from Britain could be sold east, through river routes, toward the Byzantine Empire. Some may have reached markets far beyond Scandinavia. Their journey did not always end in a longhouse. For some, it stretched across continents, and yet history rarely recorded their voices. We know about Viking kings. We know about battles. We know about famous leaders. But we do not know the names of most English women who were captured. Their experiences were written only in church prayers, asking for protection from the fury of the Northmen. Back in England, the raids forced political change. Leaders like Alfred the Great strengthened defenses. He built fortified towns. He organized armies. He negotiated treaties. Eventually, Viking power in England transformed from raiding to ruling. The Danelaw became part of English history. Cultures mixed there too. Some English women married Norse settlers willingly in later generations. Trade replaced pure violence. But that later mixing should not hide the earlier terror. For the first generations, fear was constant. Imagine a young girl growing up in coastal England, hearing stories of the ships, hearing about neighbors taken, watching the sea with suspicion. Even when no ships appeared, fear lived inside memory. The psychological impact lasted long after individual raids ended. Entire communities carried trauma. And across the sea, in Scandinavian farms, English women carried another kind of trauma. Displacement, isolation, loss of identity. Yet from that pain, something unexpected grew. New communities, new families, new identities that were neither fully English nor fully Norse. By the 11th century, the Viking Age itself was fading. Raids reduced. Kings centralized power. Christianity spread. Slavery slowly declined in northern Europe. The era that had brought so much fear began to close, but its consequences remained. The descendants of enslaved English women lived as part of Scandinavian society. Some may have risen in status. Some may have married free men after manumission. Some may have become grandmothers, telling stories that mixed two worlds. And here we see the deepest truth of this story. The horrifying fate of English women in Viking slave markets was not just about chains. It was about transformation through suffering. It was about lives broken and rebuilt in foreign lands. It was about how power can move people like goods, yet cannot fully erase human identity. In the final part, we will step back and look at the full picture. How this slave trade changed Europe. How memories survived, even when names were lost. And why this chapter of history still matters today. The Viking Age did not last forever. By the late 11th century, the lawnships no longer arrived on English shores. With the same terror, Scandinavian kingdoms had changed. Christianity had spread widely across the north. Trade became more stable. Large-scale raiding slowly faded. But the story of the English women taken into Viking slave markets did not end when the raids stopped. It had already reshaped Europe. To understand the true impact, we must step back and look at the bigger picture. During the height of Viking expansion, thousands of people across Britain and Ireland were captured. Many were men, many were children, but women were especially targeted because they were valuable in multiple ways, as workers, as mothers, and as symbols of control. Markets such as those in Dublin became centers of this human trade. From there, enslaved women were carried north and east across vast trade routes. Over time, these women became part of Scandinavian households. They raised children. They worked land. They influenced daily life in small, quiet ways. And this influence lasted far beyond the Viking Age itself. Modern research into DNA has revealed something powerful. In places like Iceland, a large portion of early female ancestry traces back to the British Isles. That means many of the women who helped build early Icelandic society were not originally Norse. They were likely taken from England, Ireland, or Scotland. Their names are gone, but their bloodlines remain. This changes how we see history. When we imagine Vikings settling new lands, we often picture only strong warriors and bold explorers, but behind them were women, some willing settlers, and some captives. Without those women, Viking settlements could not grow. Without mothers, there are no generations. This does not turn suffering into something positive. It simply reveals how deep the impact was. The horrifying fate of English women in Viking slave markets was not a short tragedy. It became part of the foundation of new societies. Yet in England, the memory of Viking terror lived differently. Monks wrote prayers asking for protection from the fury of the Northmen. Chronicles recorded raids, burned monasteries, and fallen kings, but they rarely followed the captives' stories beyond the sea. Why? Because once taken, they were unreachable. In medieval times, crossing the sea was almost like crossing into another world. There was no communication, no rescue missions, no negotiations for return. Families were separated forever. Imagine a mother in an English village whose daughter was taken at 15. She would never know if her child lived or died. No grave to visit, no letter to hold, only uncertainty. That uncertainty is one of the deepest pains in human experience. For the women themselves, identity became complex. Were they still English after 20 years in Norway? Were they still Christian before Scandinavia converted? Were they Norse if they spoke the language and raised Norse children? History does not give easy answers. Human identity is not fixed. It changes with time and survival. Some women may have found a kind of stability in their new lives. Others may have carried silent grief until death. We cannot know each story, but we can understand the system. The Viking slave trade was not random cruelty. It was organized. It was economic. It was normalized. Slavery existed in many parts of the world at that time, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa. The Vikings participated in this larger global system. But for English coastal communities, the trauma felt personal. The sea was once a source of trade and travel. Now it became a source of fear. Children grew up hearing stories of dragon-headed ships. Women looked at the horizon with suspicion. Over time, England adapted. Kings built stronger defenses. Fortified towns protected inland populations. Naval forces improved. Leaders such as Alfred the Great strengthened resistance and negotiated peace when necessary. Eventually, Viking settlers became part of English society too. They married locally. They adopted Christianity. They contributed to what would become the English nation. In a strange way, former enemies became neighbors. But beneath this blending of cultures lies the earlier pain. The women taken in chains did not choose cultural exchange. They experienced forced migration, forced labor, forced relationships. Their story reminds us that history is not only made by kings and warriors. It is made by the powerless too, often in silence, often without record. Today, when we study the Viking Age, we see museums filled with swords, ships, and treasure.